Okay, our next instructor is Lord Christopher Monckton, and Lord is not his first name, it is his title. He comes all the way from the United Kingdom, and I met him at a climate change conference in New York City, and he gave one of the keynote speeches. He had me in stitches laughing. I mean, my stomach was hurting. It was so much. I said, this is a, I mean, we think of someone like a British lord, oh, it must be some stuffed shirt. Well, this fellow is no stuffed shirt. It was an amazing presentation, and he is a true advocate of liberty and freedom, and he's a brilliant man, and we're so pleased to have him here at our humble little camp. So please give him a warm hand.
Well, Hal, after that wonderful and entirely undeserved introduction, I just can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. Now, at the legislative drafting unit of the European Commission, they don't do simple, so they do not call a spade a spade. No, they call it a one-person operated, manually controlled, foot-powered implement of simple and robust, yet adequately efficacious lignometallic composition, designated primarily, though by no means exclusively, for utilization on the part of hourly paid operatives deployed in the agricultural, horticultural, or constructional trades or industries, as the case may be, for purposes of carrying out such excavational tasks or duties as may from time to time be designated by supervisory grades as being necessary, desirable, expedient, apposite, or germane, with regard to the ongoing furtherance of the task or objective in hand, or on the other hand, underfoot, Secretary General. Now, I'm going to speak to you in the same kind of plain language that the framers of your Constitution used. And you are going to speak to me in that same language. We're not going to talk socialist gasboard language. We're going to talk plain English. So I'm going to ask you to answer me a question. It's your Constitution. What is it for? Anybody? Hands up. There's a token for anybody who does this nicely. We'll go with you, sir, first.
The rights of the people.
The rights of the people to do what?
To pursue life, liberty, and happiness.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where do those words come from?
The Declaration of Independence.
Declaration of Independence, very good. And the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution are your two most precious founding documents. So they are to guarantee life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the key word, I would say, in those three words is liberty. Because if you go back in the history of political thought to early imperial China, 4,000 years ago, that was where, as far as we can tell in the documents that have come down to us, the political philosophers first began meditating upon what was the big divide in politics. Where did people divide into the sheep, into the goats? Where do they divide into the left and to the right? What is the difference? And what would you say, anybody, was the difference between the two sides in politics? Yes, sir? Liberty. Liberty is the dividing line. You're quite right. Do we have a token for this man? Who's got the tokens?
Yes.
Right, well, we'll make sure you get one later, because, you would have another one, because you've earned it. The dividing line is liberty. The factions that were identified by the early Chinese philosophers were libertarianism on the one hand, which they called Confucianism, after the great philosopher of early imperial China, whose Analect is a very short book, and this is a collection of his sayings that was made by his followers after his death. So it's rather like the Quran in that respect. It wasn't written by Muhammad. Likewise, the Analects of Confucius wasn't written by Confucius. It was a collection of his sayings put together by his followers. And it gives an impression of a very charming, very enlightened, very gentle man who thought that people should be as free as they could be to pursue whatever they wanted to do. In this case, life and the pursuit of happiness. They should have the freedom to do these things. And on the other side of the fence in early imperial China were the legalists, and we would call them totalitarians. Now, the early Chinese empire was fiercely centralist. It was regulated right from the center. Ordinary people had no say in it at all. There was an entire class of mandarins who were the top civil servants of the empire. They were all wealthy. They were wealthy because the emperor was allowing them to be wealthy. They imposed and collected taxes from the citizens. The citizens had no say in anything. It was a rigidly totalitarian, top-down, centralized governmental system. Now, when your founding fathers wanted to break free and have their own system of government, they had to justify to themselves, as well as to the rest of the world, why they were declaring independence and why they wanted their own government. And this wasn't easy because at least half the population that they were claiming to represent wished to remain as subjects of His Majesty the King. So they had to take extra trouble to explain what they were doing and why they were doing it. And they started out, as you will remember in the Declaration of Independence, with a list of the grievances they thought they had against the king. And this is one of the two kind of slightly hollow notes from the British perspective in these founding documents, because the king was not really in charge of anything. By that stage, the notion of the divine right of kings and the absolute monarchy had long since gone. They had gone when King Charles I had been executed on the scaffold in 1649. But I'm going to give you his last words, because his last words led to the foundation of the United States. He said this: "Liberty and freedom consists in having of government those laws by which the people's life and goods may be most their own." So far you would agree, but then he added this: "It is not in having a share in government. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things." And that was the last gasp, literally, of absolutist monarchy. Moments later his head was off, and that was the end of the idea of the divine right of kings throughout the Western world. It survives now only tenuously in Thailand and Japan. But as far as the West is concerned, that was an end of it. Now, what happened next was that between 1649 and 1660, we had a republic. And it was a dismal thing. It was a Puritan republic. It was vicious, it was totalitarian, it was centralist, and we couldn't wait to get rid of it. And in 1660, when the son of Charles I was welcomed back to his throne, the people of England lined the streets for 80 miles from London to Dover. And when you think there were only 1 million people in England at that time, very nearly all of them were there. They were so anxious to have monarchy back rather than the dismal republic that they had had for those ghastly, murderous 11 years. That then was the history which all of your founding fathers knew well. They were widely read, learned, enlightened, and kindly intentioned men. And how fortunate are you that such great men should have been the founders not only of the physical corporation, which is your republic, but also of the idea of that corporation, which is expressed with such beauty and such power and such extraordinarily commendable brevity in first the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and then a couple of decades later in your great Constitution of Liberty. And this Constitution is a most remarkable document. And it was compiled in a most remarkable way. It was compiled by people who knew that that first part of King Charles's last words was correct. That liberty and freedom consist in having of government, you have to have government, those laws by which the people's life and goods may be most their own. You can see this is an entirely anti-socialistic, anti-totalitarian sentiment. But the king thought that the people ought not to have a share in government. Your founding fathers thought that they should. And then began the remarkable and astonishingly successful experiment in which a people rose up and said, we will declare ourselves to be an independent people. And as you've heard from Dr. Pester, always there were those who first spoke the idea that the people could run their own government. And I always think of Patrick Henry, liberty or death. They wanted to be free. More importantly, they didn't want this freedom selfishly for themselves. They wanted it for all of you. And therefore there is a particular characteristic of your constitution which makes it enviable. I envy it, and I wish we had it in Britain. And what is that characteristic that makes your constitution unique in essence and degree among all the world's constitutions? Can anyone tell me? What makes it unique? Come on, you're men of ideas. Think of an idea and try it out.
I'll give you one.
Sir, yes. It's the shortest. It's certainly one of the shortest. I certainly can't think of a shorter one. I'm looking only for the lads and lasses, not the old farts here.
Put my hand up.
No, you're an old fart too. A pretty one, but an old one. So, any of the younger folk, come along now. What is unique? What is special to you about your? Yes, ma'am. Stand up so you can be heard, and project your voice.
A bunch of people came together and put their ideas together to make the one constitution.
That's certainly the first step towards the answer. One of the remarkable things about how your constitution came to be framed is that it was done, as far as they could do it in those days without television and the internet, in public. And they achieved this by having reporters sitting in on the convention and writing in the local newspapers and publishing collections of letters and thoughts about it. You'll think of the Madison papers in particular, so that the people were part of the process of framing their own constitution. They knew who the representatives were. They could get in touch with them. They could say, I see you were saying that, you ought to be saying this. There was a proper debate among the people about what shape their constitution should take. And as a result of that debate, and as a result of the sheer openness with which this process was conducted, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, ma'am, and I'm glad that you're bursting to get in there, they produced this remarkable document which had this unique characteristic. Ma'am, it's your on. What is it?
So they had to...
Stand up and project your voice.
So sometimes they disagreed with each other's ideas. So one would have an idea, so another person would disagree. And so they really had to brainstorm. It was really hard, but they brainstormed.
They had to brainstorm. That's another piece of the puzzle of how they got to this unique characteristic. Yes, sir?
It's the government, not the people.
That's the answer. Another token for this man, because that is, well, you've briefed him, but anyway. Right, the answer is this, that this constitution is unique in the essence and in the degree to which the people bind the government by this document and not the other way about. That is why this document is so outstanding. Now, when the European Union, by contrast, was trying to establish a constitution, I'm going to tell you a little bit of the history of that, very briefly. Tell you a story about it. And there was a constitutional convention, because they had all these tedious treaties that nobody understood. They were thousands of pages long. Your point about the brevity of the Constitution is absolutely right. Thousands of pages of guff in these treaties that nobody was inspired by. So they decided they would have a constitutional convention. I wonder where they got that idea from. But it met in private, behind closed doors, but my noble friend Alexander Stockton, the Earl of Stockton, was a member of it. And so he and I would meet in a certain London club over lunch. We would go through the agenda for the convention. I would suggest amendments because I knew all the details of these treaties and I knew what needed to be changed. And so we said we wanted to take the power away from the unelected commissars and put it in the hands of the elected representatives of the people. Where did I get that from? Anybody? That idea that all legislative power, can anybody quote the Article 1, Section 1 of your Constitution? Yes, ma'am. All legislative power, can you do it?
The Congress of the United States shall be vested in a Congress of the United States consisting of a House of Representatives and a Senate.
Very good. I'll just repeat that so everyone can hear. All legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives, period. And that period is important. We would call it a full stop, but you're still learning English. You'll catch up one day. Period. Full stop. Why is that period important? Because what it is saying is that nobody else can make laws for you except those whom you have elected to make those laws for you. And that is a very important concept, because that's the concept by which the people bound their government to serve their will. And that is what is unique about the United States Constitution. The entire manner in which it was framed, which is why these two ladies who talked about that are so absolutely right, the open, democratic manner in which it was framed, led to the construction of a document which was consciously and deliberately the repudiation of the imagined, and to be fair, largely imaginary tyranny of the United Kingdom in those days. And in fact, just to put that point in context, I'm going to make you an offer on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen. If you will only agree to return to the fold and end your ambitious, interesting and not unsuccessful experiment in running your own show, I'm going to offer you a deal whereby all your taxes will be remitted. You never have to pay them again, except for a tax of 50 cents a pound upon tea, with the stipulation that in future you must put the tea in the teapot and not in the harbour, because it tastes better that way. So the point is this, that actually there wasn't any great real difference between Britain and America at that time. King George III was suffering from an agonizing disease called porphyria, which turned his face bright purple and made him, 3/4 of the time, completely mad. He was incapable of taking any decisions. The government was in the hands of a Council of State directed by the elected Parliament of the United Kingdom. So you were not dealing with this tyrant George III that is made out in your independence documents. There was a certain amount of understandable propaganda in those recitals of grievances. They were a little bit kind of overdone to justify to the rest of the world why you were doing this. And the other point at which I think the rest of the world looking on would be a little cynical at the shape of these documents, and in this second case I think perhaps wrongly cynical, is that there was your Constitution and its founding fathers talking of liberty this, liberty that, and liberty the other, and yet they kept slaves. And the slaves had no liberty at all. They were entirely doing whatever the will of their masters was, and they weren't even paid to do it. And there is a contradiction. And if you listen to socialists today, they'll say that invalidates the entire process of the Constitution because it was tainted from the start because they didn't really believe in liberty. You shouldn't buy that. The French have a saying, autre temps, autre mœurs, which means in a different age, they had a different morality. Now, if we go back to the history of slavery, to ancient Rome, we know from the accounts of, for instance, Pliny writing to Trajan, how the slaves were cared for and how positions in a great house were much sought after, because if you became a slave in a great house, all right, you didn't have your liberty, but you were well cared for, you were well provided for, there were doctors, there was food, there was a roof over your head. It wasn't a bad living compared with what you would get if you weren't a slave somewhere else. So slavery wasn't seen by some of those who endured it in ancient Rome as being a bad thing, though they all took their liberty whenever it was offered them. Here, the case was a little different. The slaves were shipped in appalling conditions from Africa. The larger part of them didn't survive the journey. A lot of people were killed just being transported here. And that is a part of your history which is as disfiguring as it was a part of our history. So what I'm not doing is lecturing to you on this point out of a feeling of any sort of moral superiority. I'm simply saying that as a matter of historical fact, there was this curious dichotomy between the demand of the citizens of your nation at that time for liberty and the fact that this liberty was not going to be accorded to slaves. That did not come until the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln, and some have said out of more a desire to justify what the Union did in the Civil War, but nevertheless that was when slavery eventually became abolished. So I mention that part of your history because the socialists will try to attack the Constitution on the ground that it was a complete fraud from the start. But it wasn't. It was absolutely vital that somebody somewhere in the world, for all their faults and defects, for all that Jefferson owned slaves, that is not the point. The central point of that Constitution is that power was, at the very least, taken away from a central governing authority. It wasn't actually the king, but it was a central governing authority, and transferred to a diffuse governing authority in the shape of the people themselves. And the people themselves, through their representatives, got together and they bound, and to this day, bind their successors by this Constitution, which is not easy to change. Now, your founding fathers were wise. They said, yes, we may in future times have not foreseen the changes that might come. And I'm going to look at some of those changes a little bit later on. Changes that make parts of your Constitution a little bit out of date. So how did the framers of your Constitution deal with the fact that this Constitution couldn't be written in stone because it couldn't foresee the changing circumstances that might come in hundreds of years' time? What did they do? Anyone?
They set up a system so you could amend the Constitution.
Correct. You, sir, are very well informed. There is a provision within this Constitution which allows for its own amendment. And how does that amendment take place? What has to happen? Anybody but you, sir? Yes, sir.
2/3 of the House and Senate.
Quite right. 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate, at least 2/3, must vote in favour of an amendment before it can stand part of your Constitution. Now, when was that last done and for what purpose? Anyone? Well, as far as I recall, and I could be corrected on this, the last amendment gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. Previously it was 21. I think I'm right about that. That, I think, was the last amendment that got through, and that was in the 1960s or 70s, quite a long time ago. Now, the next question I have for you is this. I'm going to do an experiment. And for this experiment, I shall need a $1 bill. And I happen to have one of those just here, a rather grubby $1 bill, but it will suffice. I want you now to get together among yourselves and elect somebody who has the fastest sporting reactions among you. They've got to be really quick, because I am going to drop this dollar bill through their fingers will be here, and I will drop this dollar bill, and they've got to catch it before it falls to the floor. And if they do, how about this? They can keep it. And $20 on top.
Whoa! 21!
So, $21, that's one for each year you had to be before you could vote. Now, ladies and gentlemen, sort it out among yourselves. Who is going to be your representative?
Who's promising?
No, the adults have nothing to say in this. This is the lads and lasses only. I want you to sort this out among yourselves. And I'm going to stop until you do.
Okay, I'll distribute the $20 among everybody. All right. Let it go.
Oh, very
Now, you are offering yourself, madam, are you? Do you have the support of those around you? All those in favour of this lass who has come forward and offered herself. What is your name?
Grace.
This is Grace, a charming name for a charming young lady. Right, Grace. Hands up all those who are in favour of Grace as being your champion.
Hands up.
Hands up, hands up. Hands up all those who are against Grace as your champion. Oh, there's a few churlish ones over here. However, I declare two things. One, that Grace has won that by a substantial majority. She is your champion, ladies and gentlemen. But I also declare that when it was clear that most of you had simply frozen and you had no idea how you were going to decide who should come forward, she offered herself and said, right, I am going to take the lead.
Leadership. Yeah.
And she did so with such success and with such a charming smile on her face that the majority of you voted for her. And of course there were the churlish ones in the corner here who didn't. And you can have them executed later. But the great thing is that Grace, having been successfully elected as your champion, we will in a few moments do this experiment. But the important thing about this was I offered you the chance to set up your own process by which you chose somebody. I wasn't going to tell you how to do it. And you were taken completely aback by this. And you froze. And it was very interesting watching. You think, oh my God, how do we do this? Grace spotted that while you were all with your thumbs sucking, wondering what to do, she could take the opportunity. And this is a perfect example of what Dr. Pester was saying earlier, that most of us are sheep. And every so often there is one who is, albeit a very charming one, a wolf. And the wolf is the leader of the pack. So now, if you will stand just over here, and what you do is you put out your hand, whichever hand is fastest, like that, with the thumb and finger ready to receive the note, all right? Now, you have it so either side of the note, so that if I drop it, you can catch it. You've got that other finger ready. Is it sort of suitably pinched in? Don't you know? Keep it slightly closer together so you've got some chance. All right? Now, what I am going to do is I'm going to drop this note and you're going to catch it. You understand the deals? All I'm going to do is drop the note and you're not going to catch it. because it's so quick, you have to be very alert. But we're going to have a vote on this. Are we going to give Grace another go? I don't think I even need to take a further vote on that. It sounds like a pretty unanimous choice. Put out your hand again. You've now got the idea. You have to be very quick indeed. And you see, she's got to be quick, because otherwise it just slips through her finger and it's gone again. Now, what this demonstrates, ladies and gentlemen, is that however talented and however somebody takes the initiative, they may prove unworthy of the task that they have stepped forward to perform. But in this case, Grace did not prove unworthy, because you see, this is a trick. And I learnt it from an itinerant Southern Baptist Baptist minister in Texas. And nobody can catch that note because there is a certain minimum time from the eye to the brain to the hand, and the note will fall between your fingers just before that minimum reaction time can happen. So there was no way that you could have done that, but you didn't know that, and you just thought, I am going to come forward anyway and demonstrate leadership. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to have another vote, because this is a democracy here, and we're going to say, are we going to allow Grace to have her $21 for having been a very good sport? And I take it there's nobody against that. There's nobody against that. I did this once at a school in England. It was a Catholic school, and there was a holy nun sitting at the front, and she said, but you can't give her the money. She didn't do the task. And I said, Your Reverence, welcome to democracy. So in that case, there is the dollar. And somewhere, there is the $20.
Thank you.
And you shake me by the hand. In fact, you give me a kiss. Well done, bless you. And Grace, you get one more thing. You now get the chance to tell this audience here, if there was one change, if there was one amendment that you had the power to make to this Constitution, what would it say?
To change game, or make a new game that's easier
And easier than what game?
than the dollar thing.
Oh, right. She says that in future, people like me should make a new game that's easier than the dollar game, and that should be written into the Constitution. Grace, that is a hilarious answer. Absolutely wonderful. You are worthy of your $21. Give her a round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, this is great. Thank you very much. Now, my purpose in conducting, that was actually a series of experiments, was to put you to some small extent in the frame of mind of those who had to frame your Constitution. They were suddenly faced, having declared independence and having become independent, with the need to set up some kind of a governing system, and they kind of hadn't thought of that at that stage, and it wasn't for another 20 years that they would finally get around to it during a very hot summer in Philadelphia that was probably hotter than this summer today. It was a very hot summer, and they had to work through it without air conditioning. But when I asked you to decide who was going to be your champion, you were faced with the same ghastly realization as they were. What the heck do we do now? Previously, it's all been done for us. The speaker was there, wittering away. All we had to do was try and look as though we were staying awake. And then suddenly he's saying to us, now it's your turn. And that was the very difficult frame of mind in which those representatives came together. Now we know that they were learned, educated Christian men for the most part. We know that they were great minds. And yet they were faced with exactly that same kind of frozen moment. Oh my goodness, how do we go from having declared independence and beaten the Brits to actually governing ourselves and looking like a serious alternative to Her Majesty's government the other side of the pond? And they had that same moment of nervousness, and it's reflected very well in the early discussions of the convention as reported in the Madison papers. There was genuine nervousness about what they were doing, about how they were going to do it, genuine disagreement, as you heard from the young lass over there who explained that they had to debate all these things, and so they did. And this was a process which was not at all easy, but they came up with a triumph. And the reason why this document is a triumph is that it gives the power into the hands of the people. And here we are, 250 odd years later, and still the power is in the hands of the people, in that every 2 years, for the Senate, every 4 years, you have these elections by which you choose all three branches of your legislature: the President, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Now, originally, when the Constitution was framed, what was different about that? Well, the Senate was not originally elected. There were 2 senators from each state, as there still are, but they were appointed in those days by the state legislatures. And eventually, one of the amendments changed that. And it became that everybody was elected who was serving the people. All 3 branches of the legislature, they were all elected. We still don't have that in the United Kingdom. The Queen, of course, is hereditary monarch. She chose her parents well. The House of Lords still has a few hereditary peers in it. I'm not one of them because my father was voted out when Tony Blair, a socialist, wanted to destroy the hereditary peers. The only way he could do it was by dividing the peers against themselves. And so they took away the right to sit and vote in the Lords from most of us, including me. But am I still a member of the House of Lords? Yes, I am. Though if you want to amuse yourself, you can look up on the House of Lords website and you'll see a very rude letter from the clerk of the House of Lords to me saying, "You're not to go around calling yourself a Lord." And the letter was addressed, "Dear Lord Monckton." And how did this come about? This just shows you what a wonderful constitution you have. You don't have these complications. But this came about because when I began talking about global warming, and you'll hear more about that tomorrow, this annoyed the left enormously because they had decided that the Communist Party line on the climate was that capitalism was bad for the climate. We had to shut down the coal industries in particular, because they were the largest contributors to the Republican Party in this country, and therefore let's find an excuse by pretending it's bad for the planet. So they adopted this party line on the climate. Just a matter of interest, how many of you think that global warming is a problem? Nobody. Well, I think that means that Willie and I can leave at this point. You don't need to hear from us. But there was going to be a big debate on Australian national television, live, between me and the director of a Communist Front organisation called the Australia Institute. How do I know it's a Communist Front organisation? Well, I spent quite a lot of my life making sure that communism didn't succeed, first in Britain and then more widely in the world. And so I got to know a certain amount about it. And in particular, I got to know about how it was that these communists operate. And they had devised a plan, and this goes back to 1945, when we were about to invade Berlin. And the Allies, the Western Allies, got there first. And we were allied with the Soviets at that time against Hitler. The Soviets got there a little bit later, but we waited so that General Zhukov, who was a very great general, Marshal Zhukov of the Soviet forces, was allowed the honor of entering Berlin. This proved to be a strategic mistake because he therefore captured the one ministry building of the Reich that was still standing. And that was the Reich's propaganda ministry of Joseph Goebbels. And the big question, which you heard Dr. Pester ask earlier this morning, how could a civilized nation like Germany and Austria, the two together, how could they, who produced Beethoven and Schubert and all this Mozart, all this wonderful music, these German-speaking peoples, suddenly go into a race of monsters? Well, the way that Goebbels did this, and it was all in his files, which hadn't been destroyed when they were captured by Zhukov and his men, what they did was every time anyone who was at all effective in opposing Nazism and got up and spoke in public about it, everybody in the party was trained to trash their personal reputations. Don't argue with them about whether capitalism or communism or Nazism is better. Just say that they're paedophiles, say that they're sleeping with other people's wives, make stuff up about them and destroy their reputations. And the effect of this is not to silence the likes of me who will speak out anyway, but it means that the vast majority who would wish to speak out with me see what happens to the likes of me and they go silent. And that is how Nazism took over. And when this was discovered by the Russians in 1945, within 1 month of capturing those records, they had set up a disinformation directorate of the KGB. And this was modeled on the Reichspropagandaamt, and in particular that part of it which was concentrating on trashing the personal reputations of people outside Russia who were damaging to world communism by speaking out effectively against it. And this disinformation directorate was put under the control of Ion Mihai Pacepa. And he was the head of the Securitate, the hated and feared secret police in the communist Romania of Nicolae Ceausescu. And he was the nastiest of all the communist dictators. And so this very sinister little fellow, who's only about this high with thick pebble spectacles, he became the head of the KGB's new directorate, the disinformation directorate, desinformatia in Russian. And he then set about recruiting Western communists. He didn't need to do this in Russia because they were already in control in Russia. So they didn't bother in Russia. But outside Russia, they wanted to spread communism worldwide. That's the danger of the new totalitarian tyranny. It has ambitions to be global. And therefore, they recruited willing, unpaid Western communists to be agents of this disinformation directorate, and the only thing this directorate did was to trash the personal reputations of everyone who was seen to be effective in opposing the party line. Now eventually, after 40 years of doing this with huge success, Pacepa came to the West. He actually lives not very far from here, though I'm not allowed to tell you where. And he wrote to me just 2 weeks ago. He'd heard I was coming here. He keeps a very close eye still on what goes on here. He had seen the evil of communism, and that's why he came to the West. And when we debriefed him, he told us how many willing communists he had found in the West who were willing to trash the reputations of their fellow citizens who were effective in speaking out against communism. Can anyone guess how many there were over that 40-year period?
500,000.
You know an awful lot. It was actually twice that. It was 1 million. And at first we didn't quite believe him, but everything else he said to us was completely true. Everything that we could check was true. He wasn't boasting. He was very quiet, a very modest man, and it was a genuine conversion from communism to seeing that the illogic of exactly what Dr. Pester so brilliantly laid out for you before, the illogic of having this centralized system of government now trying to be spread throughout the world. And he realized this was wrong. He came out to the West, he recanted, he apologized, and he's written a wonderful book about it, and he sent a copy of it to me with a little thing inside it saying, "Congratulations on your effectiveness in opposing communism and progressivism everywhere." But the framers of your constitution had already seen that. They already realized these dangers. And they foresaw that there would be those coming along to try to make it as though totalitarianism in all its forms, legalism as the Chinese call it, was attractive. And in America, for as long as you have this constitution, you will have the power to resist those forces of darkness and to remain the great nation that you are. And in this, you are a beacon of hope for the rest of us, even in the old country, especially in Europe, now grinding under a sort of bureaucratic tyranny that we are breaking free from. But you and your constitution, you here in this nation upon whose very soil of freedom it is always a privilege to stand, you will keep the world free for as long as you have the courage and the integrity and the will to keep yourselves free, to retain that liberty that your founding fathers so splendidly bequeathed you in this document. And so I say to you what one of your own poets said, Longfellow: "Sail on, O ship of state, sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate." Thank you.